Sadly, the pandemic has seen a significant increase in domestic abuse. I'll join those marking this day, and I'm sure the whole House would agree we need to do far more to end domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister may remember that in August of last year, he wrote the foreword to the Ministerial Code. It says, and I quote, "There must be no bullying, no harassment, no leaking, no misuse of taxpayers' money, no actual or perceived conflicts of interest." That's 5 promises in 2 sentences. How many of those promises does the Prime Minister think his ministers have kept?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I believe that the ministers of this government are working hard and overall doing an outstanding job in delivering the people's priorities, and that's what we will continue to do. And I think if he waits a little bit longer today, he'll hear some of the ways in which this government is going to be taking this country forward with one of the most ambitious programs of investment in infrastructure, in our schools, our hospitals, for generations. And if he wants to make any particular allegations about individual ministers or their conduct, then he's welcome to do so. And the floor is his.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I didn't really hear an answer there. So why don't we go through these commitments in turn, starting with bullying and harassment. The now former independent advisor on ministerial standards concluded that the Home Secretary's behaviour was, in his words, in breach of the ministerial code, and he said can be described as bullying, which, Mr. Speaker, means intimidating or insulting behaviour that makes an individual feel uncomfortable, frightened, less respected, or put down. What message does the Prime Minister think it sends that the independent advisor on standards has resigned, but the Home Secretary is still in post?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Home Secretary, Sir Alex's decisions are entirely a matter for him, but the Home Secretary has apologised for any way in which her conduct fell short. And frankly, Mr. Speaker, I make no apology for sticking up, for standing by a Home Secretary who, as I said just now, is getting on with delivering on the people's priorities, putting already 6,000 of the 20,000 more police out on the street to fight crime, instituting in the teeth of very considerable resistance a new Australian-style points-based immigration system. She's getting on with delivering what I think the people of this country want. She's showing a steely determination, and I think that's probably why his side continue to bash her.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the reality is that any other Prime Minister would have fired the Home Secretary, and any other Home Secretary would have resigned. So I think we'll chalk that up as one broken promise. On to the next. No leaking. Over the summer, we saw repeated leaks about which areas would go into restrictions. The Prime Minister's plans to go into a second national lockdown were leaked all over the national papers, resulting in a truly chaotic press conference. And we've seen more leaking in the last 24 hours. This serial leaking is causing huge anxiety to millions of people about what's going to happen next. Now, I know there's supposed to be an inquiry underway, but can the Prime Minister tell us, is he any closer to working out who in his government is leaking this vital information?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've already told you that as soon as we have any information about anybody leaking, we'll bring it to the House. But I may say, I think the right honourable gentleman is really concentrating on trivia, when what the people of this country want is to see his support and the support of politicians across the House for the tough measures that we're putting in to defeat coronavirus. He makes various attacks on, I think, on my leadership and the handling of the ministerial code. I take them a lot more seriously, frankly, Mr. Speaker, if the leader of the opposition could explain whether or why the right honourable gentleman, the member for Islington North, is still a member of the Labour Party. Does he support the right honourable member for Islington North continued membership of the Labour Party? Yes or no? Why doesn't he answer that question?
I think I'll just answer the fact that it actually is Prime Minister's questions, not Leader of the Opposition questions. Keir Starmer.
Reasonable question, Mr. Speaker.
I think I'll make that decision, Prime Minister. And I think, thankfully, we've got the song. We don't want to lose it. Keir Starmer.
It was your end last time, by the way.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The difference, of course, is that I'm tackling the issues in my party. He's running away from the issues in his. And I take it from his answer. I take it from his answer that he's no idea who's leaking from his government. So I think that's another one in the no column. Moving on. Perhaps the most serious of the promises under the code: no misuse of taxpayers' money. For weeks, I've raised concern about the government's spraying taxpayers' money on contracts that don't deliver. The problem, Mr. Speaker, is even worse than we thought. This week, a Cabinet Office response suggests that the government purchased not 50 million unusable items of protective equipment, but 180 million. And a new report this morning by the National Audit Office identifies a further set of orders totalling £214 million for face masks for the NHS that it can't use. So will the Prime Minister come clean? How many hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money has been wasted on equipment that can't be used?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, actually 99.5%, to answer his question directly, 99.5% of the PPE, the 32 billion items of PPE that this country has secured, conformed entirely to our clinical needs once we checked it. And I think of all the lines of attack, the pathetic lines of attack that we've heard so far, this is the feeblest. Because if you remember, Mr. Speaker, we were faced with a national pandemic that on a scale that we hadn't seen before, and the government was being attacked by the Labour Party for not moving fast enough to secure PPE. I remember the right honourable gentleman saying that we needed to unblock the blockages in the system and that we needed to shift heaven and earth to get it done. That's what he said at the beginning of the pandemic. Then he complained that we moved too slow. Now he's saying that we moved too fast. He's got to make up his mind what his attack is.
Keir Starmer.
Well, it's obvious that either the Prime Minister doesn't know how much taxpayers' money has been wasted, or he doesn't care. So far, Mr. Speaker, that's bullying, harassment, leaking and misuse of taxpayers' money. I must say, Prime Minister, it's not looking good so far, so let's press on. The next one is no actual or perceived conflicts of interest. Where do I start on this one, Mr. Speaker? Last week, we learned that suppliers with political connections were 10 times more likely to be awarded government contracts. This week, the Sunday Times reports that the Health Secretary appointed one of his closest friends to a key advisory role. This friend also is a major shareholder, as it happens, in a firm that specialises in lobbying the government on behalf of its clients, and some of those clients have secured tens of millions of pounds of government contracts during the pandemic. Was the Prime Minister aware of this apparent conflict of interest?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, insofar as there are any conflicts of interest, they will be evident from the publication of all the details of all the contracts. And again, he just seems to be attacking the government for shifting heaven and earth, as we did, to get the medicines, to get the PPE, to get the equipment, to get the treatments that this country needed. And what it reveals really is a deep underlying Labour hatred of the private sector. And it's actually thanks to the private sector and government working with the private sector that the UK was able to produce the world's first usable treatment for the disease in dexamethasone, the world's first, and has worked hard to secure huge numbers of doses of the world's first usable room temperature vaccine. That's the private sector working to deliver for the people of this country. And it's common sense, conservative government working with the private sector rather than abominating them and relying exclusively on some deranged form of state control. How else does he think we could possibly have done it?
Keir Starmer.
No one's knocking the private sector. The government's knocking the taxpayer. And that's not trivial. So, Mr. Speaker, I think it's a clean sweep. Bullying, harassment, leaking, wasting public money, and obvious conflicts of interest. It's the same old story. One rule for the British public, another for the Prime Minister and his friends. Just look at the contrast between his attitude to spraying public money at contracts that don't deliver and his attitude to pay rises for the key workers who kept the country going during this pandemic. If you've got a hotline to ministers, you get a blank cheque. But if you're on the front line tackling COVID, you're picking up the bill. So will the Prime Minister finally get his priorities right, stop wasting taxpayers' money, and give police officers, firefighters, care workers, and other key workers the pay rise they so obviously deserve?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's this party and this government that has given key workers, public sector workers, above inflation pay rises this year, as he knows, for police, for the army, for nurses are now getting 12.6% more than they were 3 years ago. And it is this government that will continue to increase the living wage, as he will discover if you just contain his impatience just for a few minutes. Indeed, it's this government that has not only delivered free school meals and vast increase in spending on development around the world, but has looked after the poorest and the neediest. And one of the most important facts about the coronavirus package, the £200 billion package of support that the Chancellor has devised for lives and livelihoods across the country, is that the benefits for overwhelmingly prioritise the poorest and neediest in the country. And the reason we can do that is because we have a government that understands how to run a strong economy and to makes sure that it takes the tough decisions now that it will allow our economy to bounce back. And that's what this government is doing.
Laura Trott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the promised increase in education funding? And I look forward to hearing the detail this afternoon. Can I ask the Prime Minister that some of this money is spent on school building repairs, particularly for voluntary controlled and multi-academy trusts, such as Orchards Academy and West Kingsdown in my own constituency? These types of schools were unable to apply for the most recent round of funding and are in urgent need of repair.
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. And that's why we've allocated an additional £560 million this year for essential maintenance and upgrades in the school estate, on top of more than £1.4 billion. And in Kent, £20 million is going to Kent Local Authority, including West Kingsdown Church of England Primary School, and nearly £6 million to Kemnall Academies Trust, Mr. Speaker. And I would encourage my honourable friend to continue her excellent campaign.
Let's head up to Scotland with leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Protecting the foreign aid budget has long been a source of unity and agreement across this House and indeed across the four nations of the United Kingdom. At the last general election, every major party recommitted to that moral mission of helping the world's poorest and most vulnerable. Indeed, a senior government minister said that, and I quote, paved the way for Britain to meet the UN target of spending 0.7% of national income on aid, and that remains our commitment. Does the Prime Minister agree with that senior government minister?
Prime Minister.
Speaker, listening to members opposite talking about the 0.7, you'd think that they'd invented it. It was the Conservative government that instituted, and I think this country can be incredibly proud of what we have delivered for the poorest and neediest people in the world. That will continue. We're one of the, on any view, where this country is one of the biggest investors donors overseas in all its forms. I think we're the second biggest in the G7 on any view, in whether in percentage terms or in cash terms, and that will continue. We've seen a massive increase, as the House will know, in spending on our collective overseas commitments. And by the way, the Right Honourable Gentleman will know that is a huge benefit also to Scotland, where East Kilbride, there are people who do a fantastic job in development overseas.
Returning to Scotland, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad that the Prime Minister seemed to agree with the quote, because the words I quoted were his. It's exactly what he told the House of Commons less than 6 months ago, and I can take it that the briefing that's gone on won't be true, that the 0.7% will remain in place. And Mr. Speaker, we need to recognise that the COVID-19 is a global pandemic, and whilst we're all in the same storm, some nations have better life rafts. The World Bank estimate that the pandemic will push an estimated 88 to 150 million people into extreme poverty. In the world's poorest countries, hunger and cases of malaria are rising, and the UN projects that as many as 11 million girls may never return to education after school closes. The UK government cannot eradicate the threat of COVID-19 if there is still a threat around the world. So does the Prime Minister agree with me that keeping the commitment of 0.7% is not only the right thing to do morally, but it is the sensible thing to do in helping with the eradication of COVID-19?
Prime Minister.
Of course, I agree that the UK should be playing a leading role in eradicating COVID-19 around the world. And that's why one of the wonderful features of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, if it is approved, is that it's going to be sold at cost to partners around the world. And I wonder whether he knows quite how much the UK has already given to COVAX, to the Global Vaccine Alliance. I can tell him it's more than virtually any other country in the world. We should be proud in this country of what we're doing. I think about $800 million to support COVAX, to say nothing of what we're doing with Gavi and CEPI and other organizations. We are in the lead in promoting, not just inventing vaccines, but in making sure that the poorest and neediest around the world get those vaccines. And I think the people in this country should be very proud of what they're doing.
Let's head up to Burton with Kate Griffiths. Kate Griffiths.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's pledge in the 10-point plan to plant 30,000 hectares of trees a year by 2025. Farmers will play a crucial role in meeting this target. What financial incentives will be available to encourage them to make this long-term commitment?
Prime Minister.
My old friend is dead right, and what we're going to do is use the new freedoms we have after leaving the Common Agricultural Policy to support farmers, to beautify the landscape, to make it less prone to flooding, and we're putting £640 million from the Nature for Climate Fund into helping to support the planting of 30,000 hectares of trees by 2025, every year by 2025.
Davy.
3 weeks ago, I asked the Prime Minister to support unpaid carers who are facing extreme hardship during COVID by raising carers allowance by £20 a week. It's very disappointing the ministers haven't found that money for carers, but have found hundreds of millions for contracts handed out to Conservative Party cronies. Mr. Speaker, it's Carers' Rights Day tomorrow, so can I ask the Prime Minister again, will he either raise carers' allowance by £20 a week, as Liberal Democrats are campaigning for, or will he explain why Conservatives think unpaid carers don't deserve extra help?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll be happy to look at that specific grant again, but I have to say that you look at what we've done so far with supporting universal credit and the substantial increases in the living wage. We're doing our best to support families who are the neediest across the whole of the UK. And as I say, one of the most remarkable features of the package that we've given to support lives and livelihoods is that the benefits do fall disproportionately and quite rightly on the poorest and the neediest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure, like me, the Prime Minister welcomes the incredibly valuable contribution of our essential workers in keeping our society moving, our economy turning and keeping us safe. But we know that many of our constituents are facing challenges through COVID. So on that note, does the Prime Minister agree with me and many colleagues that as we are having intense discussions on how to balance the nation's finances, that now is not the time for an MP's pay rise?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I do agree with that, and that's why we've frozen ministerial salaries this year, as indeed they've been frozen by successive Conservative governments since 2010. And I know that IPSA will have heard my honourable friend, and I'd encourage them not to proceed.
Let's go over to Northern Ireland with Stephen Farry. Stephen Farry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Northern Ireland business community is extremely concerned that it is now impossible to be ready to fully implement the protocol from the 1st of January. Their top priority is to ask the EU for an adjustment or grace period. This request is based on respect for the protocol and is not about an extension to the transition period. Will the Prime Minister give his support to this ask?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, of course we're not going to extend the transition period, but we want to make practical arrangements to help businesses in Northern Ireland, and we've agreed, for instance, a one-year adjustment period, so there's no disruption to the flow of medicines. And we've already launched a 200 million trader support service to help agri-food businesses and others, and that's going to more details will be announced shortly, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Flood risk from new development is a key concern for many of my constituents, highlighted by a case in Ickford, where developers promised that flood risk would be a once-in-a-100-year eventuality, yet the village has flooded 3 times this year alone. With that in mind, will my right honourable friend commit to seriously beefing up the way flood risk is assessed and treated as part of the planning process?
Prime Minister.
Well, I have deep sympathy, Mr. Speaker, for his constituency in Ickford and the flooding they've suffered. I know Ickford. What I can say is it's very important that local authorities do follow the rules in making their planning decisions. I'm sure he would agree. And we're making a huge £5.2 billion investment in flood defences to protect the 300,000 homes that are at risk across the country.
Mr. Speaker, the Greater Manchester Metrolink tram system cuts carbon emissions, improves air quality and reduces congestion on our roads. As part of the post-COVID recovery plan, will the Prime Minister commit funding to extend the tram network from East Tidsbury to Stockport Town Centre in order to improve access and give much needed support to businesses and communities in my constituency?
Prime Minister.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. I will study the plan he proposes with care, though I should tell him that there is already a massive infrastructure programme underway already, and it may be that as the Chancellor will shortly announce, and it may be that in due time the scheme he proposes could benefit from those investments.
Let's head to Romford with Andrew Rosenell. Andrew Rosenell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the London area potentially entering stricter Tier 3 or Tier 2 lockdown measures, and the devastating consequences this will have to bring on jobs, livelihoods, businesses, and indeed the effects on physical and mental health, as the Prime Minister is committed to following the evidence, will he agree to a full public cost-benefit analysis on its impact on our economy and public health before he introduces anything that will lead to years of economic harm that could end up being worse on people's lives than the virus itself?
Minister.
Yes, I have a high regard for my honourable friend, and he's right to call attention to the dangers and the damage that lockdowns can do. Of course, they have to be weighed against the damage to health that's caused by a wave of coronavirus that drives out all other patients from our hospitals and affects the health of non-COVID patients as well, so very badly. We will of course be setting out an analysis of the health, economic and social impacts of the tiered approach and the data that supports the tiering decisions, as we have done in the past.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When 72 Londoners burned to death at Grenfell because of a cladding defect, we all said, never again. But for hundreds of thousands, the living nightmare of waking watch and the non-existent EWS1 form continues. So will the Prime Minister commit that no leaseholder anywhere should foot the bill for what's no fault of their own and make good on the 2017 CLG Secretary's promise to end this neo-feudal absurdity of a tenure once and for all?
Prime Minister.
Yes. Well, Mr. Speaker, she's right to call attention to the difficulties that many people are facing because of the EWS1 form, and I sympathise very much with them. Mortgage companies should realise that they are not necessary for buildings under 18 metres, and it's absolutely vital that they understand that. Whilst we get on with the work of removing cladding from all the buildings we can, and that's what this government is continuing to do.
William Case.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome plans for a green industrial revolution, particularly commitments to public transport. But delivering sustainable rural bus services has always been a challenge. But in my constituency, South Pennine Community Transport is trialling a new low-cost, low-carbon bus service that we believe could be a model to transform rural bus services across the UK. So would my right honourable friend meet with me and South Pennine Director Kevin Carr to discuss this model and look at how some of the government's £5 billion commitment to buses can be used to transform rural services?
Prime Minister.
Well, she's asking an excellent question, and we are developing a national bus strategy that will look at the needs of how to get more people to use our buses. And in addition to championing green, zero carbon or low carbon buses, we're providing £20 million for a rural mobility fund to support demand in rural areas.
Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Food bank use in my constituency has been increasing steadily as working families, including public sector key workers, struggle to make ends meet. Can the Prime Minister therefore tell us whether he thinks the median pay of teaching assistants of just under £14,000 and nursing auxiliaries of £18,000 is enough to live on? And I'll ask the Prime Minister again, instead of delivering a public sector pay freeze later today, will he instead give these key workers a well-deserved pay rise?
Prime Minister.
She's right to value key workers and the amazing job that they do, particularly teachers and teaching assistants. And they've done a fantastic work in getting our kids back into school over the last few months, and they continue to do an amazing job. And I'm proud actually of the work we've done, not just to increase public sector pay with inflation busting package in July for the third year running, but also for what we're doing to support the record increases in the living wage, delivered, Mr. Speaker, by a Conservative government, invented by a Conservative government, because Conservative governments can do these things because we understand how to run a strong economy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Lincolnshire has one of the highest populations of veterans in our country, and as such, can I warmly welcome the recent announcement to boost funding for our armed forces. Does the Prime Minister agree that one of the best ways in which we can help our veterans is to encourage employers to hire a hero?
Prime Minister.
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for the campaigns that he's running to support veterans, and we support schemes such as that run by Jerry Hill and his team at Hire a Hero, and we are encouraging businesses to hire veterans with a new national insurance tax break for businesses that do so, and of course making it easier for veterans to join the civil service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Bio Yorkshire will place York at the heart of the global bioscience economy. It will cut carbon by 2,800 kilotons, create 4,000 green-collar jobs, upskill 25,000 workers and return £5 billion to the Treasury. The government are supportive but are delaying investment until at least the devolution deal. Unemployment in York is soaring. We need this investment now. Will he start the recovery by investing in Bio-Yorkshire?
Rachel, Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as she knows, the government is committed to the 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, which will generate 250,000 jobs across the country just in the immediate term. I hope very much that Bio-Yorkshire will be amongst the beneficiaries, and I can't see any reason why it should not.
Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The news of the COVID vaccine is great for both my constituents in Wimbledon and across the country. But I believe when my constituents get sick, they should have the right to the highest quality access to healthcare. And the plans to improve and invest in St Helier Hospital would do just that. Would the Prime Minister work with me to ensure that those plans are brought forward as quickly as possible, despite the opposition from local Labour politicians?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and how typical of Labour of politicians locally to oppose what they call for nationally. I'm proud that we're going ahead with a brand new state-of-the-art hospital that's going to be built in Sutton, and with most services staying put in a modernised buildings at Epsom and St Helier. The new hospital will come as part of the government's commitment, as I say, to build 48 hospitals by 2030 in the biggest hospital building programme of a generation.
Let's head to the goer with Tony Antoniazzi. Tony Antoniazzi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the summer, we stood on our doorsteps and clapped for all of our key workers. Today, they will be hit once again with a real terms pay cut to their wages by the Chancellor's pay freeze. Now, Mr. Speaker, I really do wonder, does the Prime Minister actually realise that claps don't pay the bills?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Honourable Lady would recognise that at a time when the private sector, when the UK economy has been so badly hit, when private sector workers have seen falls in their incomes, it is right that we should be responsible in our approach to public finances. And that's what we're going to be. But be in no doubt that the commitments that we have made have been outstanding so far, above inflation increases for public sector workers just in July, 12.6% increase for nurses over the last 3 years, biggest ever increase in the living wage, and more to come in just a minute if she'll contain herself.
Richard Fuller.
Mr. Speaker, last month, Year 6 students at the Edward Peake Church of England Middle School in Biggleswade wrote to me about the impact of lockdown and their ideas for promoting a healthier planet, including encouraging people not to put waste into the sea, planting more trees and building more electric cars, making more nature reserves and cleaning up the waterways, encouraging more local electricity production and reducing air pollution so children can see the stars. So will the Prime Minister join me in thanking the students and their teacher, Miss Twitchett, and tell the House if their ideas can play a part in his green plan?
Prime Minister.
Well, it's quite uncanny, Mr. Speaker. It's as though Mrs. Twitchett and her class was standing over my shoulder as I wrote the 10-point plan, and I thank them for their telepathic inspiration. I passionately agree that this is the right way forward for our country. It's going to mobilise about £12 billion of government investment, about possibly 3 times more from the private sector, and as I say, create 250,000, 300,000 jobs. It's a fantastic way forward for our country.
John Trickett.
I'm sure that the Prime Minister will share the pleasure which all of us have in the great engineering skills which are displayed in our country, especially in the north. And that one of the great jewels in the crown are the engineers at Rolls-Royce. But is he aware that Rolls-Royce are about to offshore 350 jobs for the north of England? That will be a devastating blow to that part of the country and remove part of our national industrial infrastructure. Does he agree that the campaign of the workforce is in the national interest to retain those jobs in our country? And finally, will he use everything in his power to ensure that that offshoring does not take place?
Prime Minister.
Can I just say to the honourable gentleman, he's so right to support Rolls-Royce, one of the great companies in our country, and we want to make sure. Obviously, Rolls is suffering at the moment from the problems in the aerospace sector, the fact that no one is flying. When you make a lot of your money from servicing aero engines, as Rolls-Royce does, it's a very difficult time at the moment. We're keen to work with Rolls to ensure that Rolls-Royce, to ensure that company has a long-term future as a great British company. And he's making an excellent point, and I can assure him that the government is on it.
That's it.
Speaker, I'm aware there are obviously no perfect options at the moment, but can I raise with the Prime Minister the issue of pubs and bars who will be affected by the Tier 2 restrictions? Many of these, such as Yorkshire Ales in Snaith in my constituency, have invested considerable amounts of money into being COVID secure, and they will now be denied access to their valuable pre-Christmas trade. Can the Prime Minister look again at those Tier 2 restrictions, and if not, look at what other financial support can be offered to those bars and restaurants that cannot offer a substantial food offering during this period?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is completely right about the need to support local business, and particularly in the hospitality sector. And he should know that in addition to the £3,000 grant for businesses that are forced to close, we've got another a grant of £2,100 per month for businesses that in the hospitality and accommodation sector. That's on top of the support that we've given via furlough, obviously, and via business rates and the cuts in VAT, which are obviously intended to support the hospitality sector as well. I am keenly aware of how difficult it is for those pubs, bars, restaurants, hotels that are will face a tough time in the tiers as we come out next week. We will do our level best to support them. I should say we're also giving 1.1 billion to local councils to help them support businesses that are facing difficulties. But I just want to say one thing to the House as we come out of the lockdown. The way forward is not just through the vaccine, which we hope we will be able to start rolling out in the course of the next few weeks and months, but it's also this prospect of mass community testing. And I want to pay tribute to the people of Liverpool who have really stepped up, and in huge numbers, hundreds of thousands of people in Liverpool have been tested, and that seems to have helped to drive the virus down in Liverpool. And we want to see that type of collective action stepping up to squeeze the disease happening across the country. So, and that I think is a real way forward that will enable the hospitality, accommodation, hotel sector to come out of these restrictive measures quicker than has been recently possible. We've got two new very, very important scientific developments.
That is to answer the question, Prime Minister. I'm very pleased that the House of Commons has been able to help deliver an improvement to the sound and vision from number 10 today. But we'd like our kit back this afternoon, Prime Minister. Right, in order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order. Order. I'm very pleased that the House of Commons has been able to help deliver an improvement to the sound and vision. Oh, that's from number 10, I think. Before I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I've already got that one in. I think I might push me up. Before the Chancellor of the Exchequer addresses the Chamber, I'd like to point out that the British Sign Language interpretation of the statement is available to watch on the parliamentarylive.tv. I now call the Chancellor of the Exchequer to make a statement. Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, today's spending review delivers on the priorities of the British people. Our health emergency is not yet over, and our economic emergency has only just begun. So our immediate priority is to protect people's lives and livelihoods. But today's spending review also delivers stronger public services, paying for new hospitals, better schools, and safer streets. And it delivers a once-in-a-generation investment in infrastructure, creating jobs, growing the economy, increasing pride in the places we call home. Mr. Speaker, our immediate priority is to protect people's lives and livelihoods. So let me begin by updating the House on our response to coronavirus. We're prioritising jobs, businesses, and public services. The furlough scheme, support for the self-employed, loans, grants, tax cuts and deferrals, as well as extra funding for schools, councils, the NHS, charities, culture and sport. Today's figures confirm that taken together, we are providing £280 billion to get our country through coronavirus. Next year, to fund our programmes on testing, PPE, vaccines, we are allocating an initial £18 billion. To protect the public services most affected by coronavirus, we are also providing £3 billion to support NHS recovery, allowing them to carry out up to 1 million checks, scans and operations. Over £2 billion to keep our transport arteries open, subsidising our rail networks. Over £3 billion to local councils, and an extra £250 million to help end rough sleeping. And while much of our coronavirus response is UK-wide, the government is also providing £2.6 billion to support the devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Taken together, next year, public services funding to tackle coronavirus will total £55 billion. Mr. Speaker, let me turn to the OBR's economic forecasts. And can I thank the new chair, Richard Hughes, and his whole team for their work. The OBR forecasts the economy will contract this year by 11.3%, the largest fall in output for more than 300 years. As the restrictions are eased, they expect the economy to start recovering, growing by 5.5% next year, 6.6% in 2022, then 2.3%, 1.7% and 1.8% in the following years. Even with growth returning, our economic output is not expected to return to pre-crisis levels until the fourth quarter of 2022. And the economic damage is likely to be lasting. Long-term scarring means in 2025, the economy will be around 3% smaller than expected in the March budget. Mr. Speaker, the economic impact of coronavirus and the action we've taken in response means that there has been a significant but necessary increase in our borrowing and debt. The UK is forecast to borrow a total of £394 billion this year, equivalent to 19% of GDP, the highest recorded level of borrowing in our peacetime history. Borrowing falls to £164 billion next year, £105 billion in 22-23, then remains at around £100 billion 4% of GDP for the remainder of the forecast. Underlying debt, after removing the temporary effect of the Bank of England's asset purchases, is forecast to be 91.9% of GDP this year. And due to elevated borrowing levels and a forecast persistent current deficit, underlying debt is forecast to continue rising in every year, reaching 97.5% of GDP in 25-26. High as these costs are, the cost of inaction would have been far higher. But this situation is clearly unsustainable over the medium term. We could only act in the way we have because we came into this crisis with strong public finances. And we have a responsibility, once the economy recovers, to return to a sustainable fiscal position. Mr. Speaker, this is an economic emergency. That's why we have taken and continue to take extraordinary measures to protect people's jobs and incomes. And it is clear those measures are making a difference. The OBR now state, as the Bank of England and IMF already have, that our economic response has protected jobs, supported incomes, and helped businesses stay afloat. They've said today that business insolvencies have fallen compared to last year. And the latest data shows the UK's unemployment rate is lower than Italy, France, Spain, Canada, and the United States. And we're doing more to build on our plan for jobs. I'm announcing today nearly £3 billion for my right honourable friend, the Work and Pension Secretary, to deliver a new 3-year restart programme to help over 1 million people who've been unemployed for over a year find new work. But I've always said, we cannot protect every job. Despite the extraordinary support we've provided, the OBR expects unemployment to rise to a peak in the second quarter of next year of 7.5%, 2.6 million people. Unemployment is then forecast to fall in every year, reaching 4.4% by the end of 2024. Mr. Speaker, today's statistics remind us of something else. Coronavirus has deepened the disparity between public and private sector wages. In the 6 months to September, private sector wages fell by nearly 1% compared to last year. Over the same period, public sector wages rose by nearly 4%. And unlike workers in the private sector who have lost jobs, been furloughed, seen wages cut and hours reduced, the public sector has not. In such a difficult context for the private sector, especially for those people working in sectors like retail, hospitality and leisure, I cannot justify a significant across-the-board pay increase for all public sector workers. Instead, we are targeting our resources at those who need it most. To protect public sector jobs at this time of crisis and ensure fairness between the public and private sectors, I'm taking 3 steps today. First, taking account of the pay review body's advice, we will provide a pay rise to over 1 million nurses, doctors, and others working in the NHS. Second, to protect jobs, pay rises in the rest of the public sector will be paused next year. But third, we will protect those on lower incomes. The 2.1 million public sector workers who earn below the median wage of £24,000 will be guaranteed a pay rise of at least £250. What this means, Mr. Speaker, is that while the government is making the difficult decision to control public sector pay, the majority of public sector workers will see their pay increase next year. And we want to do more for the lowest paid. We are accepting in full the recommendations of the Low Pay Commission to increase the national living wage by 2.2% to £8.91 an hour, to extend this rate to those aged 23 and over, and to increase the national minimum wage rates as well. Taken together, these minimum wage increases will likely benefit around 2 million people. A full-time worker on the national living wage will see their annual earnings increase by £345 next year. And compared to 2016, when the policy was first introduced, that's a pay rise of over £4,000. Mr. Speaker, these are difficult and uncertain economic times, so it is right that our immediate priority is to protect people's health and their jobs. But we need to look beyond. Today's spending review delivers stronger public services, our second priority. And before I turn to the details, let me thank the whole Treasury team, and especially my Right Honourable friend, the Chief Secretary, for their dedication and hard work in preparing today's spending review. Next year, total departmental spending will be £540 billion. Over this year and next, day to day, departmental spending will rise in real terms by 3.8%, the fastest growth rate in 15 years. In cash terms, day-to-day departmental budgets will increase next year by £14.8 billion. And, Mr. Speaker, this is a spending review for the whole of the United Kingdom. Through the Barnett formula, today's decisions increase Scottish Government funding by £2.4 billion, Welsh Government funding by £1.3 billion, and £0.9 billion for the Northern Ireland Executive. The whole of the United Kingdom will benefit from the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and over time, we will ramp up funding so that total domestic UK-wide funding will at least match EU receipts, on average reaching around £1.5 billion a year. To help local areas prepare for the introduction of the UK SPF, next year we will provide funding for communities to pilot programmes and new approaches. And we will accelerate 4 city and growth deals in Scotland, helping Tay cities, Borderlands, Moray and the Scottish Islands create jobs and prosperity in their areas. Mr. Speaker, our public spending plans deliver on the priorities of the British people. Today's spending review honours our historic multi-year commitment to the NHS. Next year, the core health budget will grow by £6.6 billion, allowing us to deliver 50,000 more nurses and 50 million more general practice appointments. We're increasing capital investment by £2.3 billion to invest in new technologies to improve patient and staff experience, replace ageing diagnostic machines like MRI and CT scanners, and fund the biggest hospital building programme in a generation, building 40 new hospitals and upgrading 70 more. We're investing in social care too. Today's settlement allows local authorities to increase their core spending power by 4.5%. Local authorities will have extra flexibility for council tax and adult social care precept, which together with £300 million of new grant funding gives them access to an extra £1 billion to fund social care. And this is on top of the extra £1 billion social care grant we provided this year, which I can confirm will be maintained. To provide a better education for our children, we're also getting on with our 3-year investment plan for schools. We'll increase the schools budget next year by £2.2 billion, well on the way to delivering our commitment of an extra £7.1 billion by 22-23. Every pupil in the country will see a year-on-year funding increase of at least 2%. And we're funding the Prime Minister's commitment to rebuild 500 schools over the next decade. And we're also committed to boosting skills with £291 million to pay for more young people to go into further education. £1.5 billion to rebuild colleges, £375 million to deliver the Prime Minister's lifetime skills guarantee and extend traineeships, sector-based work academies and the National Career Service, as well as improving the way the apprenticeship system works for businesses. And we're also making our streets safer. Next year, funding for the criminal justice system will increase by over £1 billion. We're providing more than £400 million to recruit 6,000 new police officers, well on track to recruit 20,000, and £4 billion over 4 years to provide 18,000 new prison places. New hospitals, better schools, safer streets. The British people's priorities are this government's priorities. Mr. Speaker, today's spending review strengthens the United Kingdom's place in the world. This country has always and will always be open and outward-looking, leading in solving the world's toughest problems. But during a domestic fiscal emergency, when we need to prioritise our limited resources on jobs and public services, sticking rigidly to spending 0.7% of our national income on overseas aid is difficult to justify to the British people, especially when we're seeing the highest peacetime levels of borrowing on record. I have listened with great respect to those who have argued passionately to retain this target. But at a time of unprecedented crisis, government must make tough choices. I want to reassure the House that we will continue to protect the world's poorest, spending the equivalent of 0.5% of our national income on overseas aid in 2021, allocating £10 billion at this spending review. And our intention is to return to 0.7% when the fiscal situation allows. Based on the latest OECD data, the UK would remain the second highest aid donor in the G7, higher than France, Italy, Japan, Canada, and the United States. And 0.5% is also considerably more than the 29 countries on the OECD's Development Assistance Committee, who average just 0.38%. And overseas aid is, of course, only one of the ways we play our role in the world. The Prime Minister has announced over £24 billion of investment in defence over the next 4 years, the biggest sustained increase in 30 years, allowing us to provide security not just for our country, but around the world. We're investing more in our extensive diplomatic network, already one of the largest in the world, and providing more funding for new trade deals. We should, however, judge our standing in the world not just by the money we spend, but by the causes we advance and the values we defend. Mr. Speaker, if this spending review's first priority was getting the country through coronavirus, and its second was stronger public services, then our final priority is to deliver our record investment plans in infrastructure. Capital spending next year will total £100 billion, £27 billion more in real terms than last year. Our plans deliver the highest sustained level of public investment in more than 40 years. Once-in-a-generation plans to deliver once-in-a-generation returns for our country. To build housing, we're introducing a £7.1 billion National Home Building Fund on top of our £12.2 billion Affordable Homes programme. We'll deliver faster broadband for over 5 million premises across the UK. Better mobile connectivity with 4G coverage across 95% of the country by 2025. The biggest ever investment in new roads, upgraded railways, new cycle lanes, and over 800 zero-emission buses. Our capital plans will invest in the greener future we promised, delivering the Prime Minister's 10-point plan for climate change. We're making this country a scientific superpower with almost £15 billion of funding for research and development. And we're publishing today a comprehensive new national infrastructure strategy. To help finance our plans, I can also announce we will establish a new UK infrastructure bank. Headquartered in the north of England, the bank will work with the private sector to finance major new investment projects across the United Kingdom, starting this spring. Mr. Speaker, I have one further announcement to make. For many people, the most powerful barometer of economic success is the change they see and the pride they feel in the places we call home. People want to be able to look around their towns and villages and say, yes, our community, this place, is better off than it was 5 years ago. For too long, our funding approach has been complex and ineffective, and I want to change that. Today, I'm announcing a new Levelling Up Fund worth £4 billion. Any local area will be able to bid directly to fund local projects. The fund will be managed jointly between the Treasury, the Department for Transportation, and the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, taking a new, holistic, place-based approach to the needs of local areas. Projects must have real impact. They must be delivered within this Parliament, and they must command local support, including from their Member of Parliament. This is about funding the infrastructure of everyday life. A new bypass, upgraded railway stations, less traffic, more libraries, museums and galleries, better high streets and town centres. This government is funding the things people want and places need. Mr. Speaker, today I've announced huge investment in jobs, public services and infrastructure. And yet, I cannot deny numbers alone can ring hollow. They stand testament to our commitment to create a better nation, but on their own, they are not enough to create one. When asked what our vision for the future of this country is, we cannot point to a shopping list of announcements and feel the job is done. So as we invest billions in research and development, we're also introducing a new immigration system, ensuring the best and brightest from around the world come here to learn, innovate and create. As we invest billions in the building of new homes, we're also simplifying our planning system to ensure beautiful homes are built where they are needed most. As we invest billions in the security of this country, we're also defending free speech and democratic rule, proving our values are more than just words. And as we invest billions in public services, we're also protecting the wages of those on the lowest incomes and supporting jobs, because good work remains the most rewarding and sustainable path to prosperity. The spending review announced today sets us on a path to deal with the material matters of government, and it is a clear statement of our priorities. But encouraging the individual and community brilliance on which a thriving society depends remains, as ever, a work unfinished. We in government can set the direction. Better schools, more homes, stronger defence, safer streets, green energy, technological development, improved rail, enhanced roads, all investments that will create jobs and give every person in this country the chance to meet their potential. But it is the individual, the family, and the community that must become stronger, healthier, and happier as a result. This is the true measure of our success. The spending announced today is secondary to the courage, wisdom, kindness, and creativity it unleashes. These are the incalculable but essential parts of our future, and they cannot be mandated or distributed by government. These things must come from each of us and be shared freely, because the future, this better country, is a common endeavour. Today, government has funded the priorities of the British people, and now the job of delivering them begins. Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
Can I say it's been a very important statement. If people were, it's run much longer, which was agreed with the Chancellor, and I think it's so important. Obviously, I've respectfully divided the time up to give an increase to the other parts as well. Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Annalise Dodds.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This spending review was a moment for the Chancellor to take the responsible choices our country needs. It was an opportunity to protect key workers, secure the economy and recover jobs in every part of our country. During this crisis, we've seen who's taken responsibility. Community health workers working round the clock to keep us all safe. The teachers who kept working so key workers could too. The delivery drivers and shop staff who made sure we had critical food supplies. Earlier this year, the Chancellor stood on his doorstep and clapped for key workers. Today, his government institutes a pay freeze for many of them. This takes a sledgehammer to consumer confidence. Firefighters, police officers and teachers will know their spending power is going down, so they will spend less in our small businesses and on our high streets. They will spend less in our private sector. Many key workers who willingly took on so much responsibility during this crisis are now being forced to tighten their belts. Now, not in the medium term to which the Chancellor refers, now. In contrast, there's been a bonanza for those who have won contracts from this government. Companies with political connections have been 10 times more likely to win government contracts. So many businesses have worked tirelessly through this pandemic to support local communities, keep critical supplies going, and to produce drugs and vaccines at cost price in AstraZeneca's case, working with some of our country's best scientists. But in its response to this pandemic, the Conservative government has wasted and mismanaged public finances on an industrial scale. £130 million to a Conservative donor for testing kits that were unsafe. £150 million for face masks and £700 million on coveralls that couldn't be used. A £12 billion hit to our economy because the more effective shorter circuit breaker was blocked and a lengthier, more expensive lockdown put in place instead. £12 billion so far spent on a test and trace system that is still not working. And today, news of £10 billion in additional costs for PPE, at least partly down to the Conservatives' lack of pre-pandemic planning. This waste and mismanagement is part of a longer-term pattern, showing that claims today around levelling up simply don't match the evidence. Hospitals in Liverpool and Sandwell left unbuilt, over deadline by years and over budget by hundreds of millions of pounds. Not a single starter home built, despite almost £200 million being spent. Northern Powerhouse Rail still not even approved 6 years after being announced. The courts modernisation programme 3 years behind schedule, letting victims down up and down this country. People in the north more likely to have been made redundant during this crisis, holding everything else equal. Photo calls aren't enough. We need delivery, like Liam Byrne's promotion of green manufacturing in the West Midlands and the work of Labour mayors and councils across the country. And we need a government in Westminster that takes its responsibility towards all 4 nations seriously. That means informing the Finance Minister of Northern Ireland about the shorter timescale for this spending review ahead of time and fulfilling the New Decade, New Approach commitments. It means doing the right thing by the people of Wales to repair flood damage and make safe legacy coal tips. It means ending the barney between Westminster and Holyrood and instead working together in partnership to protect jobs and livelihoods. And it means a shared prosperity fund, which is effective because it's delivered not on the whim of Conservative ministers, but from our devolved governments and our regions. The Levelling Up Fund, the Chancellor just announced, his rabbit out of the hat, yet again involves MPs, just as with the Beechings reopening programme, going to ministers and begging for support for their areas, rather than that change being driven from local communities. So much, Mr. Speaker, for taking back control. This is about the centre handing over support in a very top-down manner. Now, Labour has been clear about the responsible choices we wanted the Chancellor to make today, to recover jobs, retrain workers and rebuild businesses. To recover jobs, Labour called for £30 billion of capital spending accelerated into the next 18 months, focused on green initiatives, supporting 400,000 jobs and bringing us in line with countries like France and Germany. This government's ambition is for half that number of new jobs. To retrain workers, we needed an emergency programme to support people back into work, but Kickstart has been slow to get started, and the skills offer for those over 25 won't start until April. The Chancellor said at the beginning of his speech that our economic emergency has only just begun. Try telling that to people who've been out of work since March. And Restart, announced today, must meet 3 key tests to be effective. It should help people who need it most, not cherry-pick. It should be up and running as soon as possible, yet it appears only a fraction of Restart funding will be available next year. And Restart must involve local actors who know their communities, not be imposed from Whitehall. And of course, job search support ultimately only works if sufficient new jobs actually exist. That's why we needed ambitious action to boost our economy and to support our businesses. To rebuild business, we called for a national investment bank, and I welcome the announcement of a new UK infrastructure bank, having lost valuable years since the Green Investment Bank was sold off. Now the Chancellor must boost its firepower, and he must deliver on his department's responsibility for the drive to net zero. We've known since the Stern report that the climate crisis is the biggest long-term threat to our economy. Yet far too often, this spending review locks us into a path that will make the transition to net zero harder, not easier, locking our economy out of the green jobs of the future. To rebuild business, the Chancellor also needs to listen to business. We're less than a week from the end of the lockdown, yet we've heard nothing about whether extra support will be provided through the additional restriction support grant for areas subject once again to tough restrictions. And the Chancellor is still threatening employers with an increased contribution to furlough in January at the worst possible time for increasing and building confidence. Mr. Speaker, in less than 40 days, we're due to leave the transition period, yet the Chancellor didn't even mention that in his speech. There's still no trade deal. So does the Chancellor truly believe that his government is prepared and that he's done enough to help those businesses that will be heavily affected? Will he take responsible action also to help those excluded from government support? Why is he still refusing to make the speedy fixes to universal credit Labour has advocated, which would aid the self-employed? And why won't he provide families with certainty by ensuring the increase in universal credit is continued beyond April? The IMF has made clear time and time again that now would be the worst time to slam on the brakes and put the car into reverse. They've called for a meaningful additional push from our government to maintain fiscal support until the recovery is on a sound footing. The UK's GDP is 10% smaller now than it was at the end of last year. We've seen the worst downturn in the G7. We needed ambitious action today to stimulate growth and maintain demand. And we needed this government to take responsibility for the real reasons why people and communities are being held back up and down our country. Over the last 10 years, child poverty has risen by 600,000. We've had the worst decade for pay growth in 8 generations. The cost of childcare has risen twice as fast as wages. The number of young apprentices has plummeted. Last quarter, we saw the highest level of redundancies on record. Social care is an increasing crisis, and despite his party's manifesto promising a long-term solution, we're still waiting. In the press, it was trailed that the Chancellor would be moving 20,000 jobs out of London, yet cuts to local authorities over the last 10 years have seen 240,000 jobs lost, 12 times that figure, with the hardest hit communities often those in the North, Midlands and South West. Today, the Chancellor could have matched his government's promise to do whatever is necessary to support local authorities through this crisis. He did not, and yet again, he showed his government's lack of confidence in its own measures by failing to provide an equality impact assessment. Mr. Speaker, the measure of this government won't be the number of press releases it issued during this crisis or the number of pictures it published on Instagram. It will be the responsible action it took or didn't take for the sake of our country. Next year, the eyes of the world will be on the UK as we assume the presidency of the G7 and of the UN Security Council and host the COP26 summit. Yet now is the time. The Chancellor has turned his back on the world's poorest by cutting international aid. It's in Britain's national interest to lay the foundations for economic growth across the world. No wonder many British businesses have condemned his move. And businesses have been more and more vocal about the problems with this government's last-minute approach, always one step behind when we need to plan responsibly for the future. We must learn the lessons from previous failures and ensure that the next challenge, the rollout of the vaccine, is dealt with as efficiently, effectively and speedily as possible. Next time, Mr. Speaker, we need a comprehensive spending review which takes responsible choices to build a future for our country as the best place in the world to grow up in and the best place to grow old in. People should have opportunities on their doorstep, not at the other end of the country. Everywhere in the UK should feel like a good place to set up home. That's what the Chancellor must deliver.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll address all the points made by the honourable member in turn, but I think it's important to note up front that despite her criticisms, I think there is in fact actually a lot that both she and her colleagues on that side of the House should welcome. More funding for public services, a pay increase for NHS workers, support for those on the lowest incomes, a once-in-a-generation investment in infrastructure, a multi-billion-pound commitment to support those looking for work, a new schools building programme, and the Prime Minister's 10-point plan. I could go on, Mr. Speaker. So whilst it's right that I believe the Honourable Lady should provide challenge, I think that even if she doesn't, the British people would judge this spending review as a reflection of their priorities: protecting jobs, defeating coronavirus, strengthening our public services and upgrading our infrastructure. If there is any politics here at all, Mr. Speaker, then surely it is unifying, and deep down I think that she will recognise that. To address the specific points, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady asked about pay and about the importance of consumption, and I agree, of course, there is an impact on consumption from pay, and she will know that the marginal propensity to consume is obviously greater the lower the income spectrum you go, which is why in particular we have protected the incomes of those on the lower incomes. Anyone in the public sector earning less than the UK median salary of £24,000 will receive a pay rise of £250 or more. Taken with all the other things we've done, including giving a pay rise for those who work in the NHS, this will mean that the majority of public sector workers next year will see an increase in their pay. Also, pay progression, promotions, all of that will also carry on, Mr. Speaker. We've increased wages for those on the national living wage, an extra £345 a year for those as the wage rate goes up to £8.91. And that, again, will help drive consumption. She talked about delivery rightly. We believe very firmly in making sure that we can deliver the change that we promise the British people. My right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary, and I chair something called Project Speed, which is already delivering benefits, Mr. Speaker, with plans for the landmark A66 upgrade, shortened in time, reduced in costs, so we can get on with delivering what the people want on time, on budget, and making a difference in their communities. She asked about the Levelling Up Fund, and I thought rather bizarrely seemed to suggest that local members of Parliament were not a good reflection on their local communities and able to articulate the local needs of their communities. But I would say to colleagues on that side of the House, they will be I'm more than happy to hear from them and their local areas about the needs that they need met, because this government will meet the needs of local communities up and down this country, Mr. Speaker. She talked about support for businesses and coronavirus. It's because we've already put in place the support through this winter period, Mr. Speaker. The local restrictions grants that we announced a while ago are paid monthly. And they work. If your business has been closed, you will receive a grant of up to £3,000 per month, depending on your rateable value. If you are a hospitality or leisure or accommodation business in a Tier 2 area, where obviously the restrictions have an impact on your ability, you will receive a grant of 70% of that value, up to £2,000 as well, £2,100 as well. And Mr. Speaker, those amounts mean that the business can help cover the fixed costs of rent. They of course have access to the furlough scheme right the way through the winter. And that comes on top of the other recent support announced for businesses. Today, I announced major reforms to the way that the apprenticeship system works, giving businesses what they have long asked for, the flexibility to spend unused apprenticeship levy funds down the supply chain with SMEs, the ability to front load payments for training that they've asked for, and we're also looking at ways to introduce even more flexibility for some professions. We also recently, Mr. Speaker, just announced an extension of the annual investment allowance for a further year up to £1 million, giving 98% of small and medium-sized businesses the ability to write off investments in full next year, which will help drive their recovery. She talked about welfare, Mr. Speaker, and again, I would stand proud of this government and previous Conservative government's record on this issue. Since 2010, hundreds of thousands of fewer people in absolute poverty, several 100,000 children fewer living in workless households, income inequality lower coming into this crisis than it was when we first came into office. But Mr. Speaker, this government cares greatly about those who are most vulnerable. We have demonstrated that during this crisis by the support that we have put in place. The evidence shows that those on the lowest incomes have been protected the most by this Conservative government. And that doesn't stop, Mr. Speaker. The temporary uplift in universal credit runs all the way through to next spring, providing security for those families. Of course, we will look, when we come to next spring, at the best way to support people, to support their families, when we have a better sense of where the economy is, where we are with this virus. But we are providing extra support for next year, Mr. Speaker, £670 million to help those struggling families meet their council tax bills, worth about £150 each for 3.5 families up and down the country. We have also said that we will maintain the £1 billion increase in the local housing allowance that we instituted this year into next year, providing support for many millions of families. And also, Mr. Speaker, we are making available further funds, as the House knows, to provide extra support for food and meals for children throughout the holidays of next year. She talked about support for local authorities. Perhaps she hasn't seen yet in the doc, and that's fair enough. We announced over £3.5 billion of extra support for local authorities next year, specifically to deal with coronavirus. That comes on top of their core spending power increasing at decade-level highs of 4.5%. That £3.5 billion is there to help meet the shortfall in sales fees and charges, help to meet the unrecoverable losses in business rates and council tax that they've experienced this year, and £1.5 billion for general pressures. Let no one say that we are not standing behind our local authorities at this difficult time, Mr. Speaker. And finally, she asked about green. And I think, Mr. Speaker, she compared us to France and Germany and questioned us, this government, and the Prime Minister's ambition. Well, let me say this about our plans. Our plans, I believe, are amongst the most comprehensive and most ambitious of any developed economy. She talked about France and Germany. This country, we are phasing out vehicles in 2030. In France, it's 2040. In this country, we're phasing out coal in 2025. In Germany, it's 2038. She talked about the billions of pounds that are spent by our friends. I think it's important when we make these international comparisons that we do understand the detail, Mr. Speaker, of what these other countries promise. In the German numbers, they include the subsidies for renewables. We do not. That happens separately outside of our plan and is worth £44 billion, Mr. Speaker, supporting renewable energy in this country through the tariff system, which is what Germany alluded to. They also, in their numbers, include support for public transport, which we, of course, do not, because that is something that we do just as a matter of ordinary course of business. I'm proud of this Conservative government's record, Mr. Speaker, the first major economy in the world to legislate for net zero, the economy that has decarbonised faster than any other in the last 20 years. This Conservative government will deliver the Prime Minister's plans to get us to net zero, and it's something that I hope the whole House can welcome and support. So, in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, this spending review puts the full force of government behind the priorities of the British people. And whilst we may have many disagreements with the party opposite, I am confident that in private, at least, they will recognise the significant investment we are making to protect jobs, strengthen our public services and improve our infrastructure. We are all in this House answerable to the people we represent. It is in their interests that we serve. Today, we have made some difficult choices in order to fulfil that responsibility. But with the positive news about the development of vaccines, the winter COVID plan being announced by the Prime Minister, and the very real hope that we are finally entering the final stages of our fight against coronavirus, now is the time for us to come together. The British people have been through so much this year. Honourable and right honourable members have been through so much this year. It is my belief that with this spending review and the fresh hope given by medical advances, we can finally begin our recovery. Now, difficult decisions and all, we must deliver on the priorities of the British people.
Let's head down.